Chapter 11. Monday mid-afternoon. Doreen hung up from her conversation with Nan, watching as Scott carefully photographed everything he could on the vase. She couldn't believe what a goldmine this house had become. And all of it had been Nan looking out for Doreen. She could feel tears pricking the back of her eyes. "What was this about whether Penny is a murderer?" Scott asked. Doreen tried to brush it away, but knew that curiosity was best killed right at the moment. Somebody just mentioned that a neighbor's husband had a heart attack, but his symptoms didn't look like a heart attack. "A lot of things can cause a heart attack," he said, "and murder is usually for the most basic of reasons." "Money, greed, and passion," she supplied. "And power," he said, tilting his head at the house. "He who controls is often the one murdered." She hadn't thought about it that way. As she traipsed outside, watching the beautiful vase be packed up in the back of the big truck, she couldn't understand how mentally she'd shifted to thinking the vase was beautiful, when before on the mantel it had been just a vase. Back inside, she watched Scott studying everything else on her mantel. "Let me know if anything else is of interest," she said in a dry tone. "I'm sure a year's worth of dust covers everything." "That's often how antiques are treated," he said. "At least the ones nobody knows have value." He picked up a couple small vases and replaced them, and then turned back to her. "All I can say is, at the moment, I'm not seeing anything else." "I presume the lamps are no good or not worth anything?" He looked at them and shook his head. "No, much too modern for anything I'm interested in. The potchairs, the lamps are all yours." "What about the dining room?" she asked. "It's full too. Do you want to take a look?" He looked at her with interest. "I don't think we ever discussed the dining room." Nan's house was laid out in lots of small rooms. Not Doreen's preferred style. Doreen led the way through the living room, to the parlor on the other side. Scott stepped in and she could hear him suck back his breath. She turned to look at him, as he stared at the dining room table. "So I guess I'm eating in the kitchen forever now." He ran his fingers through his hair. "I must have been so dazed by the living room furniture," he admitted, "that it never occurred to me to venture into an adjoining room." He turned and looked back at the door and said, "It was shut, wasn't it?" She nodded. "Yes. I was wondering about taking off the door and widening the opening, so we could have a more open concept." "As long as you're not trying to keep the natural heritage of the house, I would," he said. "I know this was a charming house in its day, but all the closed-off rooms make it darker and smaller looking, doesn't it?" "Absolutely," she said. She watched as he walked around the dining room. His gaze was on a huge candle thing in the center atop a long runner across the table, and then his hands gently stroked the table itself. She watched as his focus jumped from one chair to the next, as if counting. And then he took the chair closest to him, crouched beside it, and tilted it slowly onto the floor so he could look underneath. She pulled out her phone and texted Nan. "Is the dining room set worth anything?" Nan sent back a bolded caps text with lots of exclamation marks. "Yes." Doreen sagged onto the closest chair. "You know, I haven't even had a meal at this table yet?" "Good. It's a completely different maker," he said, "and not as valuable as your living room set, but it's certainly a very nice piece, and the fact that you have all 8 chairs." He shook his head, almost as if at a loss for words. "We won't be finished today, my dear," he said, straightening up. "I'll do a little bit of research on this set, and we're still finishing your bedroom." He glanced at his watch. "It's already 3 o'clock. So tomorrow too then?" She wasn't trying to be pushy, but she was desperate to know if this table was worth money, and if he would take it. She hated the avarice rising up within. She looked at the table, deciding if she liked it, or did she just not care. It was very dark, and that she didn't like. She much preferred light wood, like the light pine cupboard, which Scott hated. Even oak would be better. "Is this mahogany?" He sat back and nodded. It is indeed. And very much the color of its era. He checked the upholstery on the chairs and said, I'm not sure this is the original upholstery though. I'll do some research on that. She nodded, realizing that would, of course, devalue the set. But maybe not a lot. Scott sighed and said, How is it I didn't know about this room before? Because we were so busy, she said, talking about that big set from the living room and the rest of it in the master bedroom. He nodded. I'm not even sure we can get all this done tomorrow, but we will do our best. All of it has to go back to the warehouse and be crated. And then it'll be airlifted. She raised her eyebrows at that. Sounds expensive. He nodded. It is indeed. But it's also mandatory. She had no clue either way, and wasn't about to argue with him. She checked the upholstery on each chair. Well, all the chairs have the same upholstery. He looked at the table and said, Another leaf goes with this. Any idea where it might be? She looked around the room. 2 hutches are here, but I don't see any table leaf stuck behind them. I'll text Nan again. He followed her, his hands going over to the hutch. This is a matching set to the dining room, he cried out happily. He just stood and stared for such a long moment that she realized this really was a surprising discovery for him. She turned to the nearby piece of furniture and asked, And that sideboard, is it also? He looked at it and frowned. It's close, but it's not a match. She could hardly be disappointed when apparently the dining room table and 8 chairs and the hutch were all a matching set. So maybe the sideboard got lost somewhere along the line, she said, and this was an easy replacement? It looks the same to me, but I guess to your trained eye it's not. He shook his head. No, he said, and it appears all of these drawers are also full. Let me take photos. We'll leave here soon for the day, he said. They're preparing the lowboy dresser up there and the vanity, he said. I'm not even sure we'll get the bed apart today. We don't have the right tools. A couple newer screws were put in which we don't have the right heads for, and we definitely want to make sure we use the right tools for every piece. She nodded. As long as you get the rest out, then that's something. He said, So I've only got about an hour more here, and I promise we'll be back tomorrow morning. He stared at the dining room set in fascination, then looked at her. You do want to sell it, right? Her head bobbed. While you're gone, she said, I'll pack up everything in the drawers if I get time. I really don't know what to do with all the china, though. As she thought of that, she thought about china handed down through the ages. I'll ask Nan if these are sets from my great-great-grandmother. She hadn't heard back from her latest text to Nan about the table leaf, but Doreen sent her grandmother another. At that, his eyes lit up. He walked over to the hutch, opened up the glass doors and pulled out a piece of china, a small cup with a saucer. He flipped it over and let out a low whistle. It's Royal Copenhagen's Flora Danica, he said. And that is also a lovely find. Each of these pieces would have been hand-painted. He turned back to her and said, Your Nan has done a very special thing by making sure everything in this house has value. And she's done right by giving it to you now. It's much better than waiting until somebody dies. If she wasn't around, you might not be doing this. You could have just brought in a junkman and tossed it all. She hated to admit it, but that was a possibility. He deliberately backed up and said, If you don't mind, I'll take a bunch of photos. Back at the hotel, I'll have some discussions with colleagues. I'll take some photos of those pieces on the mantel too. A couple items there I just don't know about. She nodded. Nan had eclectic taste. She not only liked some antiques, but she really liked some modern pieces. That makes her not a collector but somebody who enjoyed life, Scott said warmly. As he stepped back, her phone rang. I have to take this if you don't mind, she said. It's Penny. The murderer? He asked with interest. She winced. I hope she's not. He chuckled. My dear, how could you possibly know? She didn't say anything, but headed to the kitchen. Hi, Penny. How are you? I just realized how chaotic your day likely is, Penny said. I shouldn't have called. You must have the appraiser there. It is chaotic. But the men are almost done. What can I do for you? The realtor said if we're doing any yard work, we should do it fast, like that front garden bed. She agreed we should do something with it. Curb appeal opportunity is huge, and once the photos are taken and people come to view it, it has to be in essentially the same condition. So, you want me to come today? Doreen asked, wincing as she glanced at her wrist and the time. I suppose I could get an hour in this afternoon. Scott is leaving soon, and I seem to have a bundle of energy I'm trying to wear off just from the excitement of the day. Isn't it lovely to find out you're getting money? Penny said enviously. And if you could come by, that'd be awesome. At least then, once you start, you'd know what to do to get the rest done tomorrow and the next day. When is the photographer coming to take photos of the house? Wednesday, Penny said. Wednesday. Ouch, Doreen said. That's a lot of work to be done tomorrow. I believe he's coming early afternoon. Maybe even at noon. Doreen groaned. That's a ton of work. Okay, I'll come this afternoon as soon as Scott leaves. She hung up and turned to see her vanity making its way down. At least she presumed it was from the size. She couldn't see anything of it because it was completely wrapped up in packing blankets. Scott was muttering to himself in the dining room, and she didn't dare mention the basement or the garage. But she was pretty darn sure the garage was full of garbage. Still, how could she possibly know if she didn't check it out or have Scott look at it? With all the antiques still in the house, she needed to be wary of intruders too. She'd hoped it would all leave today, but now that they had found more, apparently not. Just then her phone rang. It was Mac. Are they gone? He asked. She stepped out on the veranda and said, no, and they can't do the bed today. Oh, he said, well, that's too bad. Something about missing certain tools, how some of the bolts have been replaced over the years, and one they don't have the right tool for. Makes sense, he said. And of course, they don't exactly travel with a ton of tools. Right, she said. Cautiously she added, he also thinks the dining room set could be valuable. Mac was silent for a moment, and then he chuckled. You know what? I'm not sure I ever saw your dining room set. You keep the door to the dining room closed. Only if you go around through the kitchen, do you see it. And it's always been one of those stately rooms nobody ever uses. Exactly, she said. So he wants to do some research tonight. He's taking photos of everything right now, and then they'll come back in the morning to work on the bed and potentially the dining room set. Well, you must be thrilled. Thrilled and still terrified, she said, because that means I have to keep the place safe and the pieces in good condition until he comes back tomorrow. Right. That's why I called. To make sure things were going to plan. She stared out at the garden and said, I have a favor to ask. What's that? He asked, his tone almost like he had returned to work and was only paying partial attention. Can you take a look at the autopsy report on George? She said it in such a rush she wasn't sure he understood. Silence was on the other end. George Jordan? He asked cautiously. Yes, she said, and I know. I know this sounds stupid. It's just something I found in my living room, and something I saw in Penny's garden. I'm about to head up there as soon as Scott leaves and do some work in her front bed because she's just listed her house and they want to come and take pictures on Wednesday. Hold on, he said. You're not making any sense. Why are you working on her garden if you're now asking me about the autopsy report on her husband? He asked, his tone sharp. Do you suspect she might have murdered him? I'm not sure, she said, but the thought won't leave me alone. He groaned. You can't go looking for trouble everywhere. And how on earth would you possibly sign up to do gardening work for her if you think she killed her husband? Well, I figured it was one for the money, she said dryly. Remember that thing I need on a regular basis? He snorted at that. And two, she said, it might be a way to find out more. At that, he exploded. She winced. Obviously, I'm not going to do anything dangerous. You don't know the meaning of the word dangerous, he said in an ominous voice. I will look. But, he said, you're not in any way, shape, or form to bring it up or to mention it, or to do anything that'll cause Penny to think that's what you believe of her. Of course not, she said with feigned innocence. That would just be mean. He snorted at that. Also something you don't understand. You're the nicest damn person I've ever met. And with that, he slammed down the phone. She heard the heavy clunk and winced. Well, nice job again, Muggs, she said, feeling a body up against her leg. Only she looked down to find Goliath winding through her legs. She pocketed her phone and picked up the cat in her arms. I'm sorry, baby. You don't like all these strangers in the house, do you? She buried her face in his neck while giving him a good scratch along his face and his ears. His heavy guttural purr kicked in, and he rubbed hard against her neck and head. She leaned against the railing, and sure enough, Thaddeus, who had been quietly sleeping upstairs until the men had gone into the bedroom, had flown out the back door and was even now walking back and forth on the railing. I promise, guys, things will calm down soon. She just didn't know how soon. Thaddeus hopped up onto her shoulder and cuddled in close. Now she had Goliath in her arms, who reached out a paw, as if to swat Thaddeus off her shoulder. No jealousy, you two, she ordered. I'm tired. It's been a very long day, and apparently I have a lot of heavy physical work to do now too. She groaned at the thought, but at the same time, it might help her understand something more about George's death. Although she had no clue how or why, and she had absolutely no motive for Penny to kill George, Doreen couldn't let go of the idea.